Hi class, David Monk. This is Social Problems, Sociology 2213. And today we're going to talk about society as a problem. Not only do we have problems in society, but society itself is a problem. It's a problem because society is very messy. And we have all of these conflicts and contradictions going on in every area of society. And sociologists attempt to make sense of these conflicts and contradictions that we observe. In this course, we'll use the critical power conflict perspective. This is kind of a unique course because we typically look at society from multiple perspectives and multiple vantage points. But in this course, we're going to use this one perspective to look at the variety of social problems and the issue of social problems in society. One of the things that this perspective emphasizes is the inequality that we have in society. And this inequality has different consequences for people, for society, for our social institutions, for organizations, for the workplace, for the places we have fun and have recreation. And we're going to talk about its consequences for people in society and for society itself. The contradictions that I talked about have to do with our ideals as a society. We have a Constitution of the United States of America that says that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. We have rights that we're all equal in society. This is an ideal. But the reality is that these inequalities do exist, and those inequalities have consequences for people and society. It's not just a contemporary problem. It's something that happened in its very inception when the founding fathers came together to form the Declaration of Independence. There were certain inequalities that existed then. Only those people who had property, those people were able to participate in the political process. And later on, we had slaves that weren't able to participate in the large society in any way. We had Native Americans, and there was genocide among Native Americans. Their populations were reduced dramatically, almost to annihilation and extinction. We had the exploitation of Mexican Americans. And we also have the denial of rights for women in society. However, despite all of these troubling things about our society, there's also been evidence of progress. There have been laws that have included people who were historically excluded from having equality and having rights in society. We have the Emancipation Proclamation that virtually ended slavery. And then we have civil rights laws that included minorities in terms of public accommodations and higher educations in the workplace, and also included women as a group of people. And then eventually we included other groups like people with disabilities and veterans as well. So there has been some progress despite the problems in our society. There have been a number of perspectives that have been used to explain problems in society within the discipline of sociology. Some had observed the growing populations, and with those growing populations, crime, disease, poverty, unemployment. And there are people that tried to understand the nature of the problems that emerged, and also how we can come up with some recommendations for addressing these many problems. Talcott Parsons, a sociologist that wrote a book called Social Systems, not an easy read, let me tell you. I think it's 550 pages. Some of the paragraphs are like a whole page long. I like what C. Wright Mills said about Parsons. He said many of the things that Parsons said could have been more simplified. But in essence, he taught us the importance of understanding society as a system. And as a system, all of the parts of society, all of the institutions of society, at every level are connected with each other. They're interconnected and interdependent upon each other. Also, you should note that as a social system, a change in one part of society affects all other parts of society. We are using the critical power conflict perspective in this course. But let me just briefly mention some of the traditional perspectives that we use in examining social problems in society. First, there's structural functionalism. Everything functions to maintain the order of society, even social problems. You might look at something like crime and say, well, how can crime be functional for society? One example would be is that crime itself reinforces the fact that we have laws. And also the violation of those laws. What are the consequences for violating those laws in the form of incarceration and even capital punishment for the violation of those crimes? So if something can be functional for society, that adds to the order and stability of society, things can also be dysfunctional. Crime, though it can be looked at as functional on the one hand, can also be dysfunctional. It could undermine the rule of law in our society that holds our society together, that regulates our interactions with each other and helps us to interact with each other in ethical ways. Then you have the conflict perspective. The conflict perspective also lends some of its assumptions to the critical power conflict perspective. Looks at inequality in society, looks at exploitation, and looks at oppression. Primarily, conflict theory assumes that there are people who are the elites of society that control every aspect of society. They are primarily responsible from the conflict perspective for everything that happens. All social problems can be attributed back to the decisions and the power and privilege that's vested in those who are the elites of society. And finally, there's symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionism helps us to understand how everything is socially constructed in society. Just like those ideals we talked about of equality and inalienable rights. Those are principles, those are concepts, but they emerge out of the interactions that people have in society and often become institutionalized and have influences over what we think and what we do in our society. In addition to using these individual perspectives, we can also look at the combination of these perspectives, like in the critical power conflict perspective. We could break that one perspective down into its parts. What's the critical part? The critical part goes to the Frankfurt School in Germany that was an analysis of those in power. You know, much of research and analysis never really talks to people in power because they're kind of, untouchable, sometimes assumed to be above analysis, reproach, and criticism. But the critical school looks at those who are in power as open game, as fair game when it comes to criticism and analysis. That is the critical. The power part of it has to do with the relative power positions that we have in our society. That is a stratification system based upon an inequality between those who are positioned at the top, the bottom, and in between. We have a racial stratification system that has to do with whites being positioned at the top, racial minorities at the bottom, and in between. We have a gender stratification system that has men at the top and women at the bottom in a subordinate role in society. So we look at these inequalities from the standpoint of power. Power is the ability to realize your interest despite the resistance that others may put up against you. And then there's the conflict perspective. The conflict perspective goes back to what we talked about earlier, the social conflict theory that looks at inequality, oppression, and exploitation. That you have this elite class of people who control everything in society and are primarily responsible for the problems that exist in our larger society. Social problems, by definition, are a social fact. They're not personal problems. They're not the kind of problems that you and I can observe on a day-to-day basis and have an ability to do something about, like you're having a flat tire. You have the ability, pull out the jack up the tire, change the tire, that's not a social problem. A social problem is something that is outside of your individual observation, but influences what you think and what you do. Social problems are like that. They are big problems, problems on a larger scale than you are able to individually observe or do something about. We have sort of a criteria when we look at social problems in society. The first criteria is more quantitative, and we look at social problems as anything that affects a significant number of people. So the emphasis here is on the significant number. It is quantitative. It affects a large group of people. That could be considered a social problem. The second criteria has to do with social problems or any problem that affects a number of significant people. So the emphasis is not on the number of people as it is the importance of the people who are affected. One example would be that if we had a problem that affected the United States Senate, there are only 100 people in the United States Senate, but because of their power, significance, and influence, they are a number of significant people. The people themselves are significant and can have a detrimental effect upon society and lead to social problems. The critical power conflict perspective is very robust. That is, it has the ability to explain a broad range of problems in our society. Karl Marx is the one who pioneered this thought in looking at inequality and conflict in society. He was very critical of capitalism. He didn't only look at the merits of capitalism and the positive aspects of capitalism, but also looked at how capitalism can be oppressive and exploitive in society. He also looked on the nature of class conflict, that people are positioned in society based upon their income, based upon whether or not they are able to sell their labor, or the ones who control the economy, those who are part of the elites, or what he called the bourgeoisie in society. And then Karl Marx has the limitation that he doesn't look at things like race, he doesn't look at sex. Those will be introduced later on in a more neo-Marxian kind of perspective. But when we look at the critical conflict perspective, we look at how it examines social problems in their complexity. It looks at the inequality between those who have power and those who are the powerless, the majority and the minorities, those who are part of the dominant group and the minority group. It looks at racism, it looks at sexism, and also looks at our class differences. There are 5 propositions of the critical power conflict perspective that we will address throughout the course. And the first one is that it tends to be more insightful than a liberal or conservative perspective on social problems. Politics is very much a part of our perspective on social problems in society. Conservatives tend to believe that government has little role in addressing social problems. They tend to be more politically conservative in that respect. And further, they're economically conservative in that money is not the solution to solving social problems. Liberals, on the other hand, feel like the government has a primary role in addressing social problems, and they are fiscally liberal in that these programs should be funded by the government. So when we look at things purely from a liberal, conservative, and political perspective, we lose sight of the complexity of the problem. It is much more complex than that. Also, from the critical power conflict perspective, is that there are people who hold all the power in our society. They are the movers and shakers. They are the major decision makers. They are the people who come from elite backgrounds, families. They attend Ivy League schools, belong to exclusive clubs and organizations. They marry and intermarry into each other's families. They're part of this power elite, if you will. C. Wright Mills wrote a book called The Power Elite that looks at this inequality in society. And then in our society, we have distinctions that are marked by class differences, racial differences, and gender differences. We have this stratification system that is very much like a ladder. It is a hierarchy of statuses. The status is the position that you hold in society. And each status can be determined either by ascription, which is something that's determined at birth, or it can be determined by achievement, something that you do after birth. Your merit, your hard work, your education. We tend to look at these factors in determining your achieved status. And finally, there's a conflict between the powerful and the powerless in that those people who have power have an unequal share of resources in our society. And they determine how these resources are distributed. But not only the resources, but in terms of determining public policy, determining the rules of how society works. That is in the hand of those who have power in society. The reason why our society is troubled is because, first of all, people are in it. And more importantly, from this critical power conflict perspective, that people have the primary goal of realizing their own self-interest and at the expense of the masses of people in society. I hope that this was very informative for you. If you have any questions regarding this first lecture concerning social problems in society, do email me at dmonk@se.edu. Look to hear from you soon.